You know, there's a thing that happens to pastors sometimes, and they'll never actually tell you about this. But every so often, see, I'm really good at breaking all these silly pastor secrets to you, aren't I? I'm ruining you for anybody else. But so one of these little tricks that pastors have is every so often, the sermon that you prepared just doesn't feel right. Every so often you show up and you just kind of go, well, yeah, that's good, but now let's go in a different direction. So I was going to preach on the lepers today and how, thankfulness is good and wonderful and it's great and it's fine. But then a funny thing happened to me. I watched Ghostbusters. You remember the movie, Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd, the other guy, the other guy, the guy from Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. It's a great movie, right? One of my favorites. I think when I was growing up, I probably wore out the tape. Actually, my parents had two versions of it. There was the real version, and then there was the bit that they edited for me. Because I loved the cartoon, but I was probably too young to watch a good portion of Ghostbusters. So, they fixed it for me. It wasn't for a very long time that I realized they had done that. And I'm like, wait a minute, that wasn't in there. I was like, oh yeah, we took that out. I'm like, oh, all right. So instead, I want to look at Naaman, and the Ghostbusters bit is going to make sense. Now, if you remember Ghostbusters, there's a scene towards the end. They're on the top of this building, and they encounter Gozer, the big enemy of the movie, who the whole thing's been building up to. And at one point, Gozer asks, "Are you a god?" And the Ghostbuster says, "What? No." And so Gozer's response is, "Oh, well then die." And they're shot with lightning, and it's unpleasant for all of them. And one of them says, "Ray, when someone asks you if you're a god, you say yes." Now, what has that to do with Naaman? Well, if you remember from our reading, Naaman was kind of a big deal. He was the leader of the armies of Aram, which basically meant that he was in charge of all of the raiding parties. Raiding parties that were apparently quite successful because he had managed to raid Israel and capture at least one slave girl from there. But all in all, the guy was kind of important in the hierarchy of Aram. There was one problem, though. He had leprosy. I mean, this could be problematic for someone whose job it is to interact with people. People didn't like to be around people with leprosy. It was thought to be ridiculously contagious, even though now funny thing about leprosy, most people are immune. Yeah, go figure. It's super contagious, but most people are immune to leprosy. Our immune systems can pick it up, take care of it, no problem. But there are some people that aren't that way. And in ancient cultures, about the most shunned social class you could be is someone who was a leper. So you've got kind of this weird situation with Naaman where he's both really important, but he has leprosy. So it would be a very problematic thing for him. So all of a sudden, when one day his slave girl says, I know a guy. You know how those conversations always start? It's like, oh, I know a guy. Like, hey, do you know anybody that? I know a guy. So you always start to worry a little bit. It's like, who is this guy? Is he your brother's second cousin? Is he going to rip me off? What's going on here? So he's like, I know a guy in Israel. He's a prophet. He can take care of you. So what Naaman does is he does something rather practical, to be honest. He goes to his king and says, hey, king, could you do me a favor? I heard about this guy in Israel that can heal me of my leprosy. Could you write a letter to their king so that they know I'm not going to show up and conquer them so that I can get myself healed? Pretty sensible, right? So the king of Aram writes this letter to the king of Israel. Naaman shows up with the letter on the king of Israel's doorstep and says, hey, I got this letter. And the king of Israel reads the letter and says something like, hey, here's my servant Naaman. You're supposed to fix him. And the king of Israel's like, I can't. Am I God? I can't fix this guy. Now, over the course of a little while, Elisha the prophet hears about this. Now, I want to point out some confusion that might happen. There's two prophets that happened back to back who were really good friends, and their names are like one consonant sound off. You've got Elijah and Elisha. If you say either of them too fast, it sounds like the other. So this is Elisha. Elisha was Elijah's disciple, kind of. Elijah was the one that was taken up to heaven, one of only two people in Scripture not to die, by the way. Do you know who the other is? Enoch, thank you. Most people say Jesus. I'm like, no, he died. It didn't stick, but he died. So Elijah is poofed off to heaven with the chariots of fire, and Elisha's left, and he's a prophet in Israel and doing prophet-y things. So Elisha hears about this. He goes up to the king and says, hey, king, look, I know you kind of freaked out when Naaman showed up and you tore your robes and it was bad. Send him to me. I'll take care of him because there's a prophet of God in Israel. So the king does so. Naaman shows up on Elisha's front door. Elisha doesn't even come out to the house to meet him, but just says, oh, take a bath in the Jordan River. Now, there was a tradition among healings at this time, and it went something like this. So say this microphone stand is the thing that's to be healed. Here's what was supposed to happen. Oh, God, fix this guy, incantation, hand-waving magic stuff. And then he's fixed. This is what was supposed to happen, at least in Naaman's mind. So he was a little miffed when Elisha just said, oh, take a bath in our river. It's a little weird. Like, I could take a bath in Damascus's rivers. They're better. Why do I have to take a bath in this dirty little river? So Naaman doesn't really want to do it until his servants are like, you know what? If he told you to go roll a boulder up a mountain, you'd have done it. If he told you that you had to conquer some random kingdom, you'd have done it. Taking a bath in a river is not going to hurt you. Well, it might if you take a bath in the Jordan River down in Salt Lake, but that's a different issue. So taking a bath in the river is not going to hurt. So Naaman's like, okay, fine. I'll go take a bath in the river. So he gets in the river, dunks himself in there 3 times, just like Elisha told him to, and what happens? He's all better. So he goes back to Elisha. He says, this is great. My leprosy is gone. I know that the only God is God. Let me give you a gift. Now, in one of the grand situations where the lessons that we get don't quite make sense, it doesn't give the rest of the response. Because Elisha immediately says, no, I didn't do this, God did. And Naaman's like, oh, well, in that case, there was this weird thing where they thought that if you were going to worship a god, you had to do it on that god's own soil. So he says, let me take a whole bunch of dirt back with me, and then so I can make sacrifices to God. And oh, could you put in a word with the guy, because sometimes because of my position, I have to bow down and worship this other god, but just make sure he knows that I'm not really bowing down to worship this other god. I'm really worshiping him. It just has to look like I'm bowing down to worship this other god because of my job. Yes, he puts forth this huge, big, long disclaimer just like that. And Elisha says, oh yeah, sure, fine, do whatever you want. And then a little while later, one of Elisha's servants runs after Naaman and says, hey, my master changed his mind. He really wants stuff. Isn't that sketchy? So the servant Naaman's like, oh, I want to give this guy stuff. He healed me. I'm all for it. So he gave the servant stuff. And the stuff showed up on Elisha's door, and Elisha said, where'd all this stuff come from? So he talks to the servant and says, servant, where'd this stuff come from? Oh, I don't know. I was out doing stuff. Don't lie to a prophet. It just goes badly for you. So Elisha says, I know exactly where you were. You got this money from Naaman when you weren't supposed to. Congratulations, you have leprosy. Oh yeah, isn't that cute? Now, Elisha's also, he's the cause of one of my favorite scenes. He's got a little bit of a temper issue. Because there's a scene a little bit earlier where he's on the road and some kids come out of the village and start making fun of him for being bald. And he calls a curse down on them in the name of the Lord, and 2 she-bears come out of the woods and maul 42 of them. Elisha's got a bit of a temper, just a bit. But let that be a lesson to you. Never make fun of someone bald because they might be a prophet and call down she-bears to maul you. So what does this have to do with the question, are you a god? When presented with the opportunity to take credit, Elisha didn't. He knew that he wasn't God. He knew that the only thing he could do is point someone to God. Because he had no power to heal leprosy, he knew that that was only God. On the other hand, his servant wanted to be God. His servant wanted to take credit. His servant wanted the reward. And it didn't work out so well for him. See, we have this tendency, and it's a tendency that is perfectly natural for us. Unfortunately, our nature is sinful. Because we have this tendency to give God no credit when something good happens to us, but to blame him when something bad happens. This is something that you notice all the time. If something good happens to a person, you rarely hear them give God thanks. Something out of the blue happens. It just not something that usually occurs. But when something bad happens, people are quick to say, God, why did this happen? God, why are you punishing me? Interesting little thing. And I think what it comes down to is we like being God of our life. We like control. We like being in charge of things. And we like to think that we're in charge of our own universe. Unfortunately, we're not. Or maybe that's a fortunately. If I was in charge of my own universe, things would not go well. But we like to pretend that we are. We like to create these situations where we're in charge. But we don't want to take the blame if one of our decisions goes badly. We want to take credit, especially if things aren't our doing. But we don't want to take the blame. When someone asks us if we're a god, we want to say yes. We want to present ourselves as being the master of our destiny, the captain of our ship, the driver of our car, or whatever analogy you want to use. But that doesn't go well. The first time that humans ever made a decision on their own, it wasn't a good one. And it caused a whole bunch of problems back in Genesis 3. So we need to remember that God is the one who's in charge of our lives. God is the one in whom we put our trust and not in ourselves. And we need to remember that when things are going badly, God is with us. When things are going well, God is with us. And when we're following God, the good things, the bad things, it's all part of that walk. I mean, it's kind of a cliche story, but you've all heard the footprints thing. The times that we struggle, God is carrying us. The times that are good, God is walking beside us. The times when we're ornery, He's dragging us along with Him. I always thought they missed the drag marks. It would have fit my life a lot better. So that's really what I think this lesson from Naaman, and to a lesser extent the lesson in 2 Timothy, is teaching us today, is that God is God. It makes it awkward in English because we have the same name for Him. But God is the one that's in charge. God is the one to whom we should give thanks when things happen to us. And as we follow Him, Scripture tells us that we'll even be able to give thanks for the things that we don't like. Now, that's not an easy place to be in, but it's a promise that God gives us. That we give thanks for good, that we give thanks for bad, that we give thanks for mediocre. Because God is in charge. Now, that doesn't mean that God manipulates everything. It just means that He's in charge. He's bigger than the designs of those who wish to harm us. He's bigger than all of that. And it's up to us to remember that when we are asked if we are gods, that the answer is most assuredly no. Because God is God.